So I'm delighted to introduce Ian. Ian works on national nature reserves in the Highlands for NatureScot, and he's here to tell you about Beinn Eighe, the UK's first national nature reserve, which is celebrating its 70th year anniversary. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you very much for having me. As you heard, my name's Ian Sargent, and I'm a Nature Reserves Manager for NatureScot. I cover 9 national nature reserves in the Highlands of Scotland, and I'm very lucky to have Beinn Eighe included in that, which, as we heard, is celebrating its 70th anniversary this month. For those of you who don't know where Beinn Eighe is, it's in the northwest of Scotland, in Wester Ross, near to Kinloch. It rises up from the shores of Loch Maree up to the tops of Munros on Beinn Eighe itself, and it's about 4,500 hectares in size. If we go back to the Second World War, this is when the start of the first NNR really happened. So when we came out of the Second World War, the Nature Conservancy was established in 1949. And one of their aims was to establish, maintain and manage nature reserves. The ancient pine woods at Beinn Eighe, excuse me, were actually exploited during the Second World War for timber. And there was a bit of a concern that more of it might be lost. And so Beinn Eighe was purchased by the Nature Conservancy for £4,000 in 1951. That equates to a huge 74 pence per hectare, which even then was thought of as quite a good deal. And soon after that, in November 1951, it was declared as the first NNR in the UK. And you could argue that this was maybe the first of the sort of start of protective nature conservation in the UK, because there were no other sort of legal protected areas at that time. Around the same time, Stephen and Carlisle in the 1950s produced their book, which described all of the ancient pine woods in Scotland. This was, as they defined, pine woods that had descended from one generation to another by natural means. So they were really looking for the ancient pine woods that had likely been there since the last ice age. The map on the right-hand side here is taken from the book, and it shows the pine woods on Loch Maree Islands, as well as the pine woods on Beinn Eighe in the southeast of this map, Colleen na Glas Lita, the Wood of Grey Slope, which is the largest fragment of pine wood in northwest Scotland. And there are a few other fragments of ancient woodland in the gorges to the south of that area as well on the NNR. Since it became an NNR, Beinn Eighe has also got several other protections and accolades. It is a site of special scientific interest, and there's quite a lot of botanical interest in there. The upland assemblage actually includes a lot of habitats. There's a vascular plant interest and a bryophyte interest as well. It's also part of a European designated special area of conservation, and there's multiple habitat types and species that are protected under that. It's a core part of the Wester Ross biosphere, which is a UNESCO site. It's got a European diploma for protected areas from the Council of Europe, which is an accolade given to the most exceptional European sites. There's only 2 of those in Scotland. Beinn Eighe is one. And it's also recently been declared as the first gene conservation unit in the UK to protect the genetic interest of Scots pine, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. In 2014, Beinn Eighe NNR actually merged with the Loch Maree Islands NNR, and so it's now managed as one unit, the Beinn Eighe and Loch Maree Islands NNR. To understand the habitats and species on Beinn Eighe, it's important to understand a little bit about the climate, because this actually influences the habitats and the species quite strongly. We say that the climate at Beinn Eighe is oceanic, but what does that mean, given that Beinn Eighe is not actually at the coast? Well, an oceanic climate is one that has high annual rainfall and or high numbers of wet days. In other words, where it rains or there's precipitation of at least 1 millimeter on any day. So just to sort of understand a bit about the climate, these maps are actually drawn by Beinn Eighe, but I thought they were quite good at describing this oceanic climate. The map on the left here shows the mean annual rainfall divided by the annual temperature range. Sorry, I think I didn't finish what I was saying before, did I? In that, as well as the high rainfall and high number of wet days, there needs to be a low variation in temperature between the summer and the winter. So relatively mild winters and relatively cool summers are what you're after. So if you plot the annual rainfall and divide it by the temperature difference between summer and winter, then you get this index which describes oceanic climate locations quite well. The red arrow is where Beinn Eighe is. The map on the right shows the same thing, but with wet days rather than annual rainfall. And you can see that the west coast of Scotland and west coast of Ireland are the key areas where these habitats occur. Just to expand on that theme a little bit more, this is some of the oceanic climates that are important are the temperate rainforest, and the map on the left shows where this is likely to occur, and the map on the right basically describes this through meteorological data, but I won't go into that too much, but I'll talk more about that later. And similarly, liverwort-rich oceanic heath, and again, that can be described quite closely by using meteorological data. So there's a vast range of habitats on the NNR itself. As I mentioned, the ancient pinewood was the sort of primary interest initially. And this is obviously Scots pine dominated. It's quite open canopy with a well-developed underlayer of quite long heather. It's also got birch and rowan and oak, juniper, and small numbers of holly and other species as well. A lot of these occur in gorge woodlands where they're harder to reach in terms of loggers or people that had exploited the woodland in the past. They didn't fell the trees there, and also the deer can't get into those gorges quite so easily. But there's a large area, which I said is the largest in northwest Scotland, on the shores of Loch Maree. We've also got a lot of oceanic bryophyte-rich heath up in the higher parts of the site, along with lots of dry heath, wet heath, blanket bog, and several other habitat types. And these habitats support a whole host of different species. There's been well over 1,000 invertebrate species recorded on the site and 115 bird species. Today I'm going to focus mostly on the habitats and the plants, of which we've recorded over 680 species of plants on the site. Beinn Eighe itself has got a huge altitudinal range, so it goes from just 10 meters above sea level at Loch Maree and goes up to the top of the Munros, which are over 1,000 meters in height. That means that there's probably a differential of temperature of about 6 degrees from the bottom of the site to the top of the site, and obviously a huge influence of wind in that as well. So this sort of diversity of weather and climate means that we've got quite varied habitat types on the site. At the very tops of the mountains, it's very rock dominated, often with lots of unstable scree. There is some moss heath habitats on the top, and in some cases they contain some quite uncommon species. For example, Ruistac Beg, which is the rounded peak in the center of this image, has Arctic kidney lichen on the top, which is boreal lichen with very few other records within the UK. But it's not until we come down to about 500 or 600 meters in altitude where the vegetation starts to dominate over this rocky ground. And in these areas, we can find prostrate juniper, which grows with mountain bearberry and exposed heaths. It's actually one of the largest areas of prostrate juniper in the British Isles, and it's of considerable conservation importance. It's quite a rare and fragile habitat type, and often associated with burning, or at least lack of burning. It's very sensitive to burning, and the prolonged period of no burning at Beinn Eighe has perhaps contributed to its range at Beinn Eighe. The juniper grows very low, as the prostrate name suggests, and creates a sort of humid layer underneath for a small number of vascular plants and lots of bryophytes to shelter. One such bryophyte, which is of particular interest at Beinn Eighe, is Herbertus borealis, which is the northern prongwort. This is a large, sort of bright orange, leafy liverwort, which is actually quite abundant on the thin soils of the plateau. However, it is endemic. This is the only known location on Earth for this species, and although it grows quite widespread on Beinn Eighe, it doesn't appear to grow in many other places, which is quite unusual. There are a number of other liverworts that occur in this habitat type. This is purple spoonwort, and we've recorded over 160 species of moss and nearly 100 species of liverworts on the site itself. And again, this is perhaps thanks to the oceanic climate and the minimal disturbance for a prolonged period of time on the site. Other things that we can find in the upland habitats are wild thyme, alpine lady's mantle, dwarf cornel, crowberry, cloudberry. Actually, I've seen quite a lot of fruiting cloudberry this year. I don't know if that's just me or if that's something that's happened this year to make that so, or maybe I've just been visiting areas with lower herbivore numbers. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has seen something similar. On some of the ungrazed cliffs and rocky areas, then you can find roseroot, tooth, wintergreen, and in fact, both these species grow in a small high altitude exclosure, along with a number of other species like rock whitebeam, holly fern, globe flower, frog orchid, intermediate wintergreen. And this exclosure was set up in 1957. It's actually on a slight lime-rich outcrop. And was fenced off to exclude deer from the area to try and encourage these plants to continue to grow. This is actually the only exclosure that has been set up that still remains. We've taken down most of our deer fences in other areas, but this one's important because it allows these more unusual plants to occur. It's a really interesting place to visit. I think BSBI members have been there in fairly recent times to have a look as well. Also on these sort of rocky habitats in the higher parts of the site, sort of over 350 meters, we can find trailing azalea as well. And as we move down into the bogs, the sort of typical wet species of bogs and flushes, we find sundews and butterworts. We get 3 species of sundew, starry saxifrage. And then as we move into the woodlands, common species like chickweed wintergreen, but actually also fairly common to pine woods, but fairly uncommon to the western pine woods. We also get creeping lady's tresses and the dainty orchid lesser twayblade as well. And sticking to the orchid theme, in the grasslands between some of the woodlands, you can find lesser butterfly orchid. In terms of management and conservation, our aim over the last 70 years has been to connect the ancient fragments of woodland to make them larger, more resilient, more robust to things like climate change and disease. It has been quite a challenge. The soils are very poor and quite thin and depleted. As such, we've used quite a different range of techniques to try and expand the woodland and to create this wider, more robust habitat. In the past, that's been using things that we might not do now. For example, we did plough peaty soils to establish trees, which we now know is not a good thing to do. And we also have planted non-native species of tree and non-local provenance trees. All of those have now been removed, but it just shows you over a 70-year period what we actually learn in terms of establishing native woodlands. We've also learned that the Scots pine is genetically important. So Scots pine at Beinn Eighe is actually genetically different to Scots pine in other parts of Scotland. It's the pine that grows at Beinn Eighe is actually better able to cope with waterlogged soils than pine from eastern parts of Scotland. And we actually think that this pine might have migrated to Scotland after the last ice age by a slightly different route. So it's really important we retain that genetic diversity, and so the provenance is really important. And as such, when we're growing trees for planting, we would only grow trees of local provenance. So that means we collect the seed ourselves and we grow it in our own tree nursery for planting out on the NNR. We grow around, or we have grown around 20,000 trees per year for planting on the NNR, mostly Scots pine, but also juniper, oak, holly, hazel, and a number of broadleaf species. And all of those have grown from seed collected on the NNR to retain that genetic diversity, but it also reduces the risk of introducing new pests and pathogens, which can be spread if you're moving tree stock around the country. Our planting is actually coming to an end. We have planted up quite a number of areas to try and connect these fragments, and we really only wanted to have that intervention for as minimal time as possible. We're going to continue with some enrichment planting for species that are not common and need a bit of helping hand in getting the seed source spread. But otherwise, we are really focusing now on natural regeneration to maintain and, where appropriate, expand this woodland. We're achieving all this without using deer fences. So the main herbivore on Beinn Eighe are red deer, pictured on the right. There's also roe deer and small numbers of non-native sika deer in the area. The deer densities are relatively low at Beinn Eighe, which means that we can achieve this. But in colder spells in the winter, we do find that deer move into the woodlands to seek shelter and food. And so it's really important that we retain our deer management interventions in order to allow natural regeneration of woodland to occur. In order to make sure that we're getting the balance right, then we need to do monitoring. And one way that we monitor the woodlands, which we do annually and then more detailed every 5 years. In the annual monitoring, one thing we look at are the plants themselves, because this can tell us quite a lot about what's happening within the woodland. Particularly, we like to look at the nutritious or palatable species that deer like to eat. If we can see that those species are getting away and growing quite well, then we know that the herbivore impacts are quite low. So for example, in this image, rowan is very palatable, or is quite palatable. And you can see this image, thankfully we don't have many trees like this anymore, but this rowan is clearly quite old in that it's got quite a thick stem, it's got moss growing on it, and yet the branches don't seem to get very far at all. It's been completely toparied by herbivores, probably in the winter. And sometimes this occurs as trees start growing out of the field layer where they become more obvious. Holly is also a nutritious plant, a palatable species, surprisingly, and things like bramble as well, the spiky ones. And ivy and honeysuckle are also really good indicators. And these are all present in the woodland, but we would like them to expand and become more widespread. We've also been recently doing a little bit of mapping work to show the change in woodland from 1951 through to the present day. This is actually an aerial image from 1950, which was as close as we could get to 1951. And it shows areas of woodland that have been coloured in green. But you can actually see on this map that you can still see the old logging routes where they had felled the trees during the Second World War. If we fast forward to the most recent image, which is actually 2018, you can see that the woodland has expanded quite substantially in a lot of these areas. I'll just flick back and forth and then you can see that change. The red areas are regenerating woodland, excuse me, or lower trees, small trees in height. So we use some mapping rules to actually classify the woodland extent. And this used the height of the trees to determine if they were trees or not, using sort of clever GIS technologies. And this meant that we can actually see how much of the woodland has changed. And we could see that in 1950, there was 158 hectares of woodland. And in 2018, there was 223 hectares. So an increase of 65 hectares, although that hugely underestimates the actual woodland itself, because using this technique, they only include the tree itself. And so you miss out on the woodland glades that you would normally include within a sort of woodland area. But it's quite good for using as a baseline for change. So on the map on the left, the brown area was the woodland extent in 1950, and the green area and the brown area are what is the extent of woodland now. So we still have most of that brown area and all of the green area. And you can see how we've been trying to, on the lower ground of the site, connect these sort of fragments together. As part of this work, interestingly, we've also, on the map on the right, you can see the change per 1 hectare grid square. And in the ancient woodland, you can actually see there's been a decline in woodland cover from 1950 to 2018, the orange and red squares. Now, this is probably due to the fact that a lot of the trees are quite old. They're sort of 350 to 400 years old, and they're coming to the end of their life. And so the old trees are starting to die. And that's why it's really important in our woodlands that we encourage natural regeneration to get the new generation of trees to come through afterwards. And I'm pleased to say in a lot of our woodlands, we do have that. It's just those regenerating trees are too small to be picked up through this GIS technology. But it illustrates the importance of protecting our woodlands and getting the balance between herbivores right. I'm also going to show you a few fixed point photography images that we've taken to show changes or no changes in the woodlands over the last 70 years. This image here you can see is in the ancient woodland, and surprisingly there's been very little change. Even the tree doesn't look that different considering it's nearly 90 years between the photographs. There's still an area of open bracken in the left-hand side of the image there, which hasn't recolonized with trees either. And on the left-hand side, you can see an old image from some of the early days of it being an NNR, and an image from 2019 on the right. You can see that large tree has died. And actually, if we only need to go back to 2013 to see that that tree was still alive. So from these images, we can start to learn a little bit about what's going on and things that you might not notice just by walking around the site. You can also see on the image on the right that some willows are starting to come through the field layer, which is quite encouraging to see as well. And again here, this is just showing young trees starting to grow just within the last 5 or 6 years or so down Glen Torridon, which is really encouraging. I wanted also just to mention that we are hosting the Darwin Tree of Life project at Beinn Eighe at the moment. This is a really ambitious project that is trying to sequence the genome of something like 70,000 species within the UK, and they're using Beinn Eighe as one of their field bases. We still support quite a lot of research, and this is just one example that we've got going on at Beinn Eighe at the moment. They've actually got a really good exhibit as part of this conference. So if you go over to the conference website, you can, and some of the exhibits, you can check out a bit more detail about what they're doing with the Darwin Tree of Life project. And I just wanted to finish up by saying what our ambition is for the next 70 years. Really. So we hope that our vision for a connected woodland becomes a reality. We really hope that the woodland manages to become larger, more connected, which will hopefully encourage it to be more biodiverse and more resilient. We also want that to obviously to retain the rare species of mosses, lichens and liverworts that often get forgotten about, and hope that they're sort of flourishing amongst all of the other species that we find at Beinn Eighe, along with things like pine martens, golden eagles, white-tailed eagles, and of course red deer. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for listening, and if you've got any questions, I'll try my best to answer them.
Thanks very much, Ian. That was really fascinating and amazing photos. So Jim, I know we've got quite a few questions here. Would you like to ask the first one?
Yes, certainly. Ian, that's a fantastic talk. Some brilliant images there. A quick one on cloudberry. I have seen it fruiting quite a bit this year, not as much as in 2019. I think 2019 was a particularly, if anyone can remember those pre-pandemic days. 2019 was a great year for cloudberry fruits. Anyway, loads of questions. And could I, there's quite a few about deer grazing. And as well as those fixed point photographs that you showed, which were fantastic. David Welsh asked, were monitoring plots set up in the 50s to monitor the changes over the 60 or 70 years of the NNR?
Yeah, so there's been a huge amount of research that has happened on Beinn Eighe. I mean, that was one of the reasons that it was first established as an NNR. A lot of that research has been quite well documented, but obviously things change through time and methods change. And so a lot of that is written up in the literature. We still use quite a lot of it today in our theory, but we currently use the sort of more standard methods for assessing herbivore impacts now, rather than sort of making a comparison to how things were. Deer numbers have changed quite a lot over the last 70 years, although, as I said in the talk, the deer densities in and around Beinn Eighe are relatively low, and have been for quite some time. But nevertheless, deer are very specific grazers. They will tend to focus on the plants that they find the most palatable. And so if you do have them at quite high densities, then they can selectively browse out specific species and leave behind the less nutritious species. And the problem that we've had at Beinn Eighe in the past, over the last 70 years, is that it's one of the only woodlands in the area. So deer do tend to be attracted into it for shelter in the winter. And although the overall density is quite low, you can get quite high numbers of deer at certain times of the year.
That's great, thank you.
I was really fascinated to hear about the genetic differences in Scots pine, and there's a few questions about that too for you, Ian. The question from Fal about, is there any morphology difference in Scots pine in the field? And another question about, where is it now? If you could just expand a little on that, how they think that the different genetic variant came to Beinn Eighe.
Yeah, so I have to admit, I don't know so much about the genetics. My understanding is that they look the same, that it's the same species. It's just that they are, within their genetic makeup, there are slight differences that mean that the pine in the west of Scotland at Beinn Eighe is better adapted to coping with the wetter climate and things like that. And the wetter soils. It's probably slightly slower growing, but that's maybe more influence of the climate. If you compare somewhere in the Cairngorms, for example, with the same level of herbivore impacts to the west coast of Scotland, then the trees in the Cairngorms would grow an awful lot quicker, and the trees at Beinn Eighe grow really quite slow, especially in the wet areas. But they think that the trees are more closely associated with pine from places like France and Spain than sort of northern Europe, which I think the pine in the east of Scotland is more likely to have come from. So it's possible that they either came by a different land bridge during the last ice age, or some people have suggested they might actually have managed to hang on in some places during the last ice age and have expanded out from there.
Brilliant, really interesting.
Great, thanks. There's a couple of questions. One about whether does bracken inhibit pine regeneration? And Stefan Helfer asked, do you have any issues with rhododendron?
Yeah, good questions. Yes, so bracken can do. So often what you find is that if you clear an area of woodland, you create a huge amount of light very quickly, and bracken can exploit that and can create these quite dense areas of bracken. But bracken is native, and we certainly don't do any management on the site to manage bracken in any way. There are thick areas of bracken, but there are also sort of glades within that, and that's actually really important because there's a lot of species that rely on bracken, but also having that diversity of density of bracken. But where it forms that really thick, dense mat of bracken, and then when the fronds all die back and it forms a thick mat on the soil, yes, that will inhibit tree growth. And that's why we don't want to exclude deer from our woodlands by putting up a fence, because deer actually create a bit of disturbance when they come in. They create paths through it which break through to the soil and can create areas for trees to grow. So it's just about sort of trying to promote natural processes to manage that. In terms of rhododendron, yes, there is rhododendron ponticum in the area, and obviously we have been managing that for quite a number of years. So on Beinn Eighe NNR itself, it's actually not that common, but it's a constant battle. It does still occur in the wider area in the village, and also on Lochmary Islands, the odd one pops up. And basically it's a constant rolling program of walking through the woodlands and controlling it, and it just never seems to go away. But it's not, we're lucky that we don't have any really dense areas that are inhibiting the natural vegetation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. We're just running out of time now on questions, so it'd be brilliant if you could type, because there's lots of questions there in the Q&A for you, if you could type some answers in
Yeah, sure,
for the rest of them. Thanks so much. That was a really fascinating talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.